You ever wonder how we actually know what the world was like 1,000 years ago? I mean, with no photos, no videos, historians basically have to be detectives. They're piecing together this giant puzzle of the past from all the little clues left behind. So let's dive in and see how they do it, using a 1,000-year slice of Indian history as our case study. Okay, first up, take a look at these two maps. Now, believe it or not, they're both showing the Indian subcontinent, but they look wildly different, don't they? The first one, from 1154, almost looks like it's upside down to us today. But then you jump forward about 600 years to the 1720s, and suddenly the second map looks much more familiar. So what on earth happened in those 600 years to cause such a massive difference?
And that question brings us to our first bit of detective work, a tale of two maps. These maps are our first big clue for understanding just how much can change over time. And I'm not just talking about the world itself, but how people even saw the world.
What's really cool is when you break down the differences like this. The first map, made by the Arab geographer al-Idrisi, has South India where we'd expect North India to be. But then, 600 years later, the French map doesn't just flip things around, it's also got these incredibly detailed coastlines. And the why behind it is actually pretty simple. It was made for European sailors and merchants. The whole purpose of the map was different, and that changed everything. So here's the bottom line, and it's a huge one for historians. Context is everything. When they look at any document, map, or text, they have to ask, who made this, why did they make it, and when did they make it? If you don't answer those questions, the past can be seriously misleading. All right, so let's switch gears from visual clues to something a little sneakier, words. It turns out it's not just maps that change over time. The very words we use to describe the world are constantly evolving too. To really get history, you kind of have to crack the code of past languages. Check this out. Take the word Hindustan. Today, we might think of it as just another name for the modern country of India. But if you went back to the 13th century, a chronicler used it to describe a much, much smaller area. It was basically a political term for the lands that were under the control of the Delhi Sultan. It had nothing to do with South India at all. And you can see that whole journey right here. By the 16th century, the emperor Babur was using Hindustan to talk about the geography, the wildlife, and the culture of the entire subcontinent. The meaning got bigger, it expanded, and eventually it became the national idea we have today. Same word, but three completely different meanings over time. And here's another great example, the word foreigner. For us, a foreigner is someone from another country. Simple. But back then, a foreigner, or a pardesi, was just any stranger who wasn't part of your village or your social circle. So a person living in a city might have called someone living in a nearby forest a foreigner, even if they were practically neighbors. Okay, so we've got maps that tell different stories and words that change their meanings. Now let's dig into our next clue, the physical sources themselves. This 1,000-year period saw this huge shift towards using paper, which, as it turns out, created a whole new set of headaches for historians. I love this little detail because it just says it all. In the mid-1200s, paper was so rare and expensive that a scholar had to literally wash the ink off an old manuscript just to reuse it. Fast forward just 1 century, and paper was so common you could get your food wrapped in it at the market. And this boom in paper meant a boom in written records. But, and this is a big but, this was all happening long before the printing press. So, every single book, every document had to be copied by hand by people called scribes. Just think about that. For centuries, all information was passed down through this long, manual chain of human copying. Now, if you've ever tried to copy a friend's homework, you know exactly what happened next. You know how it is, right? You can't quite read their handwriting, so you make a little guess. Or you accidentally skip a line. Now, imagine that happening over and over for hundreds of years. The small changes each scribe made would just add up until different copies of this same book could end up being pretty different from the original. And you can really see the problem right here. On the left, you've got this clear, cursive script that's pretty easy to read. But on the right, you've got this other style that's way denser, more complicated, and a whole lot harder to copy without making mistakes. This is why historians often have to track down many different versions of the same text, just to try and figure out what the original author actually wrote. It's serious detective work. Okay, so far, we've been focused on all the challenges of trying to interpret the past. So now, let's zoom out and talk about what was actually happening during this 1,000-year period, because this was not a quiet, static era. It was a time of incredible movement and massive transformation. This was a period of unbelievable innovation. As people moved into the subcontinent, they brought all sorts of new things with them. New technologies like the Persian wheel for watering crops or firearms for battle. And they also introduced new foods and drinks that we think of as totally normal today. Things like potatoes, chilies, tea, and coffee. And a new technology like the Persian wheel wasn't just some neat little gadget. It completely changed agriculture. That in turn changed the economy, it changed politics, and it changed the entire social fabric. These innovations were the real engines of change. This was also a time when people were on the move. They traveled huge distances looking for opportunities. And all this movement led to the rise of powerful new groups, like the Rajputs and the Marathas. Society itself became more complicated, with people getting organized into these groups called jatis, or subcastes, usually based on their jobs and their status. And all of this brings us to our final puzzle. We've just seen 1,000 years of non-stop, dynamic change. So how on earth do historians even begin to organize it all? How do you slap a simple label on such a complex and messy period of time? Well, back in the 19th century, British historians had a pretty simple and, let's be honest, overly simplistic method. They just split Indian history into Hindu, Muslim, and British periods. That was it. It was based only on the religion of the rulers, and it totally ignored all the rich diversity and the massive social and economic changes we've been talking about. Today, thankfully, historians take a much more nuanced view. They look at the entire tapestry of society, not just who was sitting on the throne. And this is why even a common label like medieval can be tricky. You know, that word often makes us think of a time that was kind of backward or stagnant, like it was just a waiting room between the ancient past and the modern future. But as we've just seen, this era in India was anything but static. It was buzzing with transformation. So in the end, studying history is a lot like making maps. We're constantly redrawing our maps of the past as we find new evidence and gain new perspectives. And that kind of leaves you with one last thought, doesn't it? What clues are we leaving behind right now? What will the maps, the words, and the records of our time look like to a historian 1,000 years from now?